everyone. Good morning. Thank you for waking up so early and being here. It's really great to see a full room, also really cozy. So thank you to Creative Mornings for organizing this. So I'd like to start by talking about my master's thesis back in 2010 when I discovered a really small school in India. The kids there were basically disadvantaged children that were being schooled over there. And in an attempt to study visual culture and the impact of that on their education, I asked them to respond to a prompt. The prompt was, show me your place in 5 pictures. So this is what they sent me. You can see a lot of excitement in their faces taking photos. There's simplicity with their, showing me their belongings, what their environment looks like. And finally, this picture is the one that struck me the most amongst many that I got, because their place also meant just looking up and looking at the sun shining through the green leaves. So the perspective of children has been something I've really envied for a long time. Children have a very enlightening view of things. They're silly, entertaining, but also really enlightening. And but I think as adults, we kind of lose this freshness in not knowing, and we try to have these very linear paths as we grow older. We're trying to build skill. We want to become experts. We want to climb up the ladder. And even in the realm of learning, I think we've come to this point where we have very linear paths in terms of building habits. We have streaks and going down a certain milestone path. So much so that even my meditation app now stresses me out because regardless of using it so many times, I'm always on day 1. Anyhow. So I think one of the things that I do now relate to being a child is when you really pull yourself outside your cultural context and you put yourself in another city. I think if you guys have moved to Berlin from another country, the first few months of being here were really special. And for me, this is also a special relationship because I moved about 6 cities when I was growing up, just until my age of 20. And after that, I actually changed careers, first from fashion to graphic design, and then finally user experience design. And in all of these, whether it was careers or anything else, it was really about closing up, unwrapping everything all over again, and then trying to learn new languages and making new friends, whether it was about a career or something else. But today, I'd like to talk about restarting again and again and again, not a big bang of a restart, but really as a continuum, actually talking about a break in the streak and throwing a spanner in the works of practice makes perfect, so that we can wander and find and start over and wander again and find again. And so I found inspiration in this kind of a way of looking at things quite accidentally. I was working in the kitchen, not really my design space, but really the kitchen where I found inspiration to this. When I moved to LA from India, I think about 10 years ago, there was a lot that I had to learn. I felt like a child again, in that I had to unlearn a few things, learn a few things, learn to drop the use in the word color. That was hard. And I think most importantly, in retrospect, learning to cook was one of the things I had to do because I didn't have any of this anymore with me. I was basically a disaster. And I think year 2, around spring break, I decided I'm just going to pick 2 recipes off the internet every day for 14 days and just try to learn these 14 new things, or 28 rather. But what was interesting at that time, which I didn't realize, was I was learning graphic design, but this was a whole other creative skill which didn't occur to me as being creative. So I would say I actually started to learn cooking just in order to cope. But ultimately, the tactility was so enthralling and so fun that this whole idea of starting something, doing this in a couple of hours, closing up and starting again the next day was a pattern that actually helped me understand and experience a lot more. 4 years ago, I landed in Berlin for a job. I was brought here by the job as well, But I think within 4 months, they decided to close the doors. It was interesting because I had a really hard year before that trying to move here, and I was in no mood to start all over again. So I basically shut down, and I went back into the kitchen and just kind of thinking of food beyond breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I started to work on all these different experiments, and at some point I felt like maybe I should be documenting this somewhere. But this idea of being a designer and asking what's the purpose, what's the end goal, what am I trying to do here, didn't lead me anywhere. And when I thought of a blog, I was basically thinking of sad online spaces which would just die of lack of visitors, because I was very confident I would be one of them. And so I just kind of suspended my judgment and still started a journal, because I don't call it a blog, handful. And I started with a few personal projects. This is extremely personal to me in that my father took this homemade photo shoot when I was a child. He was knee-deep in this lake, and I was standing there with basically herding a bunch of paper boats with my mom. And I wanted to create a souvenir of this through food. And I said, yeah, I'm a designer. I can kind of cook, so this shouldn't be hard, right? Like, everyone knows how to cook. And so this is kind of what I landed up with, which looks really shit, actually. To the extent that I feel like now I have my own Pinterest fail meme. Anyhow. I'm not going to show you all the pictures in between this and the next point. But after this, I somehow managed to figure out some way out. I think for any chefs in the room, this would be like back of hand, but it took me several weeks to get here. So I created this, phyllo pastry boats dipped in chocolate, and then perched atop this rice pudding, which is my mother's kind of quintessential dessert. So that was the kind of tribute I started with. I went on to doing other experiments. It's basically anything that struck my mind. So this was inspired by a comment my friend made about Indians wrapping things in newspapers without using a tape. And so I wanted to make an edible candy, which was similar, so the wrapper that you can eat whole, and dyed it in fruit dyes to give this sort of newsprint kind of a feel. There's another one which is about paying tribute to the Sarmishta, which I quite like. It's very new. It's simple, but it was very new to me as a foreigner. And so I started making these landscapes with that. And then finally, this one being a bunch of series that I do with fashion, because it's harking back to my previous career, translating that into a food illustration, and then that becomes a dish. So really, food became a way to feed my creative hunger at this time. And through it, I actually learned a lot. It's really very, it feels very fundamental and very accessible, because it just, we eat food every day. But at the same time, it's very provocative as a medium. It's very hard to work with. It's not easy as it appears. And at the same time, it invokes this reaction from all our senses. It's not simply about sight, but also everything else. And then finally, it's ephemeral. I mean, it was the greatest metaphor for restarting. I had to restart that boat like 20 times before getting there. So I started to cook to feed a creative hunger. And while I was doing that, 1 second. Oops, that didn't work. All right, I will skip it over, that's fine. While I was doing that, something else happened. I was really frustrated with the representation of Indian food in Berlin. So with my surprise, yeah. So with my manager at that time, Thomas Kuber, who's a German, we decided to start a supper club of our own, where I would cook Indian food, and then he would pair German craft beer to put a local spin on it. We didn't really think much of it. It was just an idea, and we said, yeah, let's try it out. And so this here is my husband who's sitting there, not Thomas, but so we put beer garden tables in our apartment, and we hosted, I think, 8 people that evening. We didn't have a name, we didn't have a menu, but we just kind of put out an announcement, and we still had some people come. And that evening, we served, I think, 11 courses, not because we knew what we were doing, but quite the contrary. We had no idea what we were doing. Cooking 11 courses is insane. But somehow, we had such a great time that we just decided to continue. We made like $30, which was nothing. But not that it was for the money, but anyhow. So then we, went on to other things. We started making these dinners based on festivals, just trying to glean more about my culture. This is an invitation, again, done by my husband sitting there. It was a teamwork, basically. He was illustrating for us, and we were putting out these things. And so, we started to wonder at some point. We were like, this feels like a product. Like, it's almost, we started with food, but actually it's a lot more. And so we were wondering what to do with it. But in the meantime, what I realized was what was beautiful was the conversations and the friendships that came from that. The community aspect is something we didn't actually think about before. And so, yeah, we kind of went on with this. We hadn't named the series, but it didn't really matter at this point. So this became about opening up and sharing. So it was kind of restarting and looking at food all over again in a different perspective. And at this point, every dinner was kind of, a different prototype. So every time we started something, we were able to try a different menu, a different location, a different theme altogether. So again, this idea of starting something and then ending it in 3 hours was a great model to be able to try a bunch of different things. And so, yeah, I just want to show you a few snippets from the last 4 years. It's just a mix of things. So yeah, it's been 4 years and 13 dinners. It seems, to me, sometimes it feels like it's not enough, but I think considering we have all jobs, I think it's fine. But in any case, the thing that we learned was that we started with food. I was interested in sharing food. But what happened was we actually learned so much more. Firstly, working on the intangible. So we started with food, but really, when people came, it was for the conversations. It was for sitting around, and it was with the music and creating this ambiance and saying, like, how am I sort of helping people understand what the cultural significance of something was. It was about collaborating outside design. So with my design manager working on something completely aside from design. It was also interesting to get your boss to cut onions for you every single dinner, like payback time. But really, just kidding. But it was actually great collaborating outside that. There was also improv. We were not perfect, so we had to continually kind of, make do with things. We had to keep the show running regardless of like having left the chickpea flour behind or whatever. And then building a small but supportive community. So we had no internet presence and no name until last year. And we just ran the whole show with a shitty little email. And we didn't have a lot of people, but whoever worked with us was a really supportive crowd. And never turning anyone away. We always had folks who would show up without making a registration, without booking. But we could never really turn anyone away. And it was a lesson in trying to deal with how hospitable do you want to be, and also improvisation to make it work. And lastly, this was for myself, unintentionally starting a new tradition. Upon reflecting, I realized what was happening was I was missing my own, the spirit of celebration and kind of fun back in India, especially during festival times. And this was a way of starting it again with a new set of friends and new set of people. So while all of this was going on, I was pendulating between purpose and craft, which is I could be going down this and actually just becoming a really skilled chef or a restaurant person. But I had to take a step back and say that's not really what I wanted to do in the first place. And what I realized was that it was about the people and was about this need for togetherness and for all of us to gather and get together. And it was really kind of humbling that a bunch of people are ready to show up at a time and a place, and there's something that could happen with that. I mean, it's also evident here right now, which I'm really grateful for. So food really became about exploring beyond. I'm not sure where this is going yet, but this is a work in progress. And we have this saying in India called Annadatta Sukhi Bhava, which means you have deep respect and gratitude for the person that feeds you. So in cooking and feeding people so much, I actually started to gain this appreciation for others who do that. And so I started to document everyday heroes, people down the street in the cafe who like really serve you with a smile and who've made a difference to my everyday life. I started working with female-led businesses in Berlin, doing photography and trying to figure out complementary skills with them. It was really a great way to just meet young women in Berlin who have these amazing businesses and who've been doing such great work. And finally, another thing that I've been exploring is how to get into, use my graphic design to sort of go back and help facilitate other people's projects. This being United Street Food, it was a market in Markham, Illinois, I think a couple of years ago, bridging refugees and locals at that time. So at this point, I think foods took another turn. It was starting to become a way of relating and respecting. So it left me as a person and myself and my interests and became about understanding what others did. So bring to a simmer, it's, as you know, it's a terminology in cooking. It's usually a point where you've done the work, you've thrown stuff in, and the flavors are developing and you have aromas building in the air. And this has kind of taken me a while to get to. I started when I actually didn't want to restart at all, but in a way I restarted again and again and again with different ways of looking at one thing. And I've found a lot of creative pleasure and satisfaction in this process, which I think no job or award or anything has actually afforded me. And I don't mean this in a complacent way. It's not that we want to be lazy. But it's just this willingness to wander and like begin again and to kind of let ideas just simmer and then come back and look at it again. So I have a few things that I wanted to share because hindsight is 20/20, of course, and things only make sense after they're finished. And so I have a few things I wanted to share about this. One was being stupid and ridiculously optimistic is really important to start on anything new, pretty much. And we can't be children again, for sure. But we can try to put our creative optimism first and then go with that rather than logic. Drop the research, something that really helped me, actually. Research is great. Research will build skill and bring expertise. But it can also be sort of a black hole and give you these boundaries that are not expected at all. And sort of going with starting over and thinking about serendipity can actually bring really unexpected results. Allowing your path to shapeshift. So this was something my professor told me 10 years ago, and it took me several years to understand. This idea of not being wedded to your goals. You don't have to always know everything. I've realized the more you work, the more work you want to make after that. It's almost infectious. And so trying to kind of let your intuition guide you along is a better way of looking at it. And if I had thought, yeah, I'm going to open a blog with followers, like that would have been a completely different path. And everything connects. This is, of course, borrowed from Charles Eames, but it really was something I've been thinking of in the last year, where I saw these two paths completely diverge, user experience and food, and I wondered, what was I going to do with them, and how do I pick between one or the other? But actually, on the contrary, like working with people in the food community helped me to understand design better in some ways, where I was thinking of how might I create a better understanding of Indian food for my non-Indian guests here in Berlin. That helped me figure out how might I create a better understanding of design for my non-design colleagues at work. So it's really about how do we make design more open and inclusive and build a culture in my company for this same thing. So, sorry. So these connections, basically led me to explore this more and more. And when I decided like food and design sort of need to converge at some point, that's actually how I ended up joining Marley Spoon too. And it's been a great opportunity to learn about business at scale. And now I have a different type of restarting, which is building a design team and a culture from the bottom up. We started from, I think, 1 designer. We're going to 11 soon. It's been an incredibly interesting but incredibly challenging experience. And so yeah, I'd like to close with, I hope this works. No, that doesn't work. Oops, sorry. There, all right. So cooking afforded me this opportunity because it's such a fundamental skill for any of us in life, but I would invite you all to go into the weekend and try to pick something from your childhood, a hobby that you've forgotten about, and kind of look at it again the next day, start over again the next day, and see where that takes you. Hopefully you will be able to see it in 1,000 new lights. Like this. Thank you.